See, the basic problem with the U.S. economy is we have too much consumption and borrowing and not enough production and savings.
But we really have some serious changes to be made, both in monetary policy. We need to restore sound money. We need much higher interest rates. And we need to transform our economy back to one based on savings and production.
But this has to happen. We have to go back to a sane economy where we save our money and actually make stuff. For the past several years, everybody thought we had a real economy. We didn't. We had a bubble. All we did is borrow trillions of dollars from the rest of the world, and we blew all the money on consumption.
It's time for Americans to stop borrowing and stop spending and start saving again. We need to produce cars and export them.
This is ABC, Local Radio Queensland.
Graham of Yarrabah has sent a message saying, how is the $1,000 payment going to benefit Australians when everything we buy is made in China? Boom, boom. The cold hard facts of realism come home. Thank you very much for that, Graham. Chris Leithner, you want to answer that question? Can you answer that? How will $1,000 benefit us when everything we buy is made in China?
Well, the question to ask, does consumption benefit? What the government wants us to believe is that the royal road to prosperity is through consumption, that we can somehow consume ourselves into prosperity. I think it's false. I think it's misleading. They also, as a corollary, through their interest rate policy, seem to be telling us that the route to prosperity has to do with debt, and I don't think that's true either. So the answer to the question has to do with not with consumption, but with production. In order to consume, we first have to produce. We're talking a big game about consuming, but we're talking precious little about producing, and that seems to be the critical question that we have to ask ourselves.
This is 612 ABC Brisbane. My question was half joking, by the way, but there you go. Well said. Chris Leithner is from Leithner and Associates. He's the evening program's honorary finance commentator, fully unpaid. But nevertheless, he very kindly comes in and gives us his professional observations about finance and economic matters when requested. So the question that many people are asking Chris today is, should we spend it or should we save it? I'll put aside the matter of exactly how we get it at the moment, but if you're on Child Benefit A, you're eligible. And some confusion about whether you can actually demand it in a lump sum or just wait for it to sort of be dropped in there automatically. But given the financial outlook for next year, as I understand things, the economic problems of overseas have not really hit Australia yet. The layoffs by the ANZ Bank and others appear to be a preemptive move to position themselves for next year. It doesn't look like we've been hit by the economic hardships of the rest of the world yet. Should we spend or should we save it?
Well, the first point is that adults will make their own decisions as they see fit. There's everything to be said for free people making that choice. That's point one.
So your main platform is that people should take responsibility for their own actions.
That's precisely right. Leading on from that, though, is returning to my previous point that everybody wants prosperity. How to get there? It's not through consumption. It's through production. So that everybody wants.
Explain what you mean.
Well, put it this way. What we're consuming, what we're literally at this moment, or what we're having for breakfast tomorrow, somebody had to produce it. We're talking about physically existing goods or existing services.
So someone has to make something.
Right. And it's logically so obvious. Some of your listeners are probably laughing. They say, well, of course, one has to produce before one consumes. But the point then is to say, well, how does one produce? And the way to produce, or the means to production, has to do with savings. Answering your question then, it seems to me, again, allowing for the fact that individuals, adults will make their own decision. Ultimately, if Australians are, and I suspect they are, serious about prosperity, then the route to prosperity has to do with savings.
So, you need an increase in production, first of all, before you need an increase in consumption.
Well, if we want more bacon and eggs tomorrow morning for breakfast, somebody has to induce the pig to grow bigger and the chicken to lay more eggs. That has to do with effort, and it has to do with the capital that's involved in order to induce that increase in production.
Well, let's choose something as simple as the car industry, which whether it's simple or not. But, we make a certain number of cars in this country, but it's not quite clear whether they're going to be around in their normal form next year, particularly given that the parent companies are overseas in the United States. What happens if all of a sudden all those workers who work for Ford and General Motors lose their jobs? They won't be able to produce anything.
Quite literally right, and it's an awful thing. We don't like to talk about it. It's worst of all when it happens to oneself, but one has to dust oneself off. I've heard it on your show where people talk in terms of, look, I've lost job X. I now have to either, through my own study, through retooling myself, I have to find other work. I have to find other means to produce new things or things other than I was producing before. So in other words, it changes the context, and obviously there are both psychological and physical costs. It's a wrenching change. I'm not minimizing that at all. If anything, I'm bringing it to the fore. But it doesn't change the fact that ultimately, and again, returning to your original point, it seems to me that policy in this country, conversation in this country, needs to give production more emphasis, and to do that, savings have to be given emphasis. We then turn around and say, well, then why is it that
the government does not want us to save money?
Precisely.
They're saying, do not save money.
You are emphatically right. And again, I shrug my shoulders. Why is this? Why isn't there an outcry as we speak? And your listeners will know it full well. The way that term deposits have fallen off in recent weeks. In actual fact, the purchasing power now is falling. That's to say the rate of interest that one receives, say, for a one-year term deposit is lower than the consumer price index. So one is going marginally, not by a great amount, I'll allow that, but one is marginally going, but one is being, in effect, penalized for savings. You're quite right that the entire, not just government policy, but the culture is one of consuming for today, and we'll leave production, and tomorrow, well, we'll leave that to its own ends.
So it almost looks like they just want to get over the Christmas hump by spending, and then we'll worry about next year.
Well, that's it, and you add in a kind of almost a liturgical element to this. We're in Advent now. Advent is a time not for feasting, but for fasting. Advent is a time not for merrymaking, but for calm and sober reflection, for repentance. So for both economic reasons and, dare I say it, for theological reasons, Australians should be thinking a fair bit about savings and deliberation rather than wild merrymaking.
5 minutes to 8. Chris Leithner, finance commentator, is my guest. Chris Leithner is with Leithner and Associates. We keep getting bombarded with requests for how to track down Chris Leithner. Just put his name, Leithner and Associates, Brisbane, in your search engine, and I'm sure it will come up. What's the current rate of inflation in Australia? Just ballpark, the CPI, as it's called, the current rate of inflation.
Right. I won't belabor it.
The Consumer Price Index.
That's right. Inflation and the CPI are separate things. That's perhaps a discussion for another day. But I've got the Reserve Bank's measure of consumer price inflation, which they conflate the two things, dated the 21st of November for all groups of goods and services as of the September quarter, 5.0%.
5% inflation. All right. Now, what's the average rate of interest I'll get on for Steve Austin in his ordinary everyday savings account for a major bank? Say?
Yep. I've simplified. I've gone to a website called interest.com.au so that listeners can check it out for themselves. To simplify, I've looked at term deposits because they're more comparable between institutions. I've simplified, and perhaps I've been a bit more arbitrary. I've looked at term deposits of $25,000 or more. Mm-hmm. A term deposit on average for I think it's 14 institutions I'm looking at for 1 year, 4.55%.
4.55. In other words, so by 0.05%, on your calculation, we're going backwards.
That's right. Given, if you like, the current settings for the overnight cash rate, which obviously differ quite a bit from what they were, say, 3 months or so ago,
I'll say.
Policy settings are penalising savers. They're rewarding debtors. And again, this is a subject of conversation we've had in the past. Government policy divides people. In this case, it's driving a wedge between debtors and creditors, between people who save and people who borrow. That's perhaps another conversation for another day. But again, the critical point is that people who are relying upon that income from their savings have taken quite a knock over the past 2 to 3 months.
So at the moment, you would say, look, we've got to produce things before we can consume things. That's what actually makes prosperity. And your other point is that the inflation rate is, depending on how you calculate it, about 5%, and the average return on your savings is 4.55. In other words, we're going backwards in both areas.
Correct.
Thank you very much. I'll speak to you again in the near future.
On that upbeat note, I thank you very much indeed.
This is